Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. A cracked window that looked just like one in my bedroom, stains on the floor resembling the ones in my hallway. It was tracking my world, piece by piece. At one point, I stood there, staring at the painting, and I felt dizzy. My palms were sweaty. I heard a faint squishing sound behind me. I turned and saw a trail of wet paint creeping along the wall from the atelier doorway. The paint had a dark color, somewhere between brown and black, and it looked thick. I tried to wipe it up, but it just smeared and made the smell worse. My eyes watered, my hands shook. My heart thumped in my ears. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in. I struggled to breathe through my mouth to avoid inhaling that rancid odor. Later that evening, I tried to paint one of my own canvases, hoping it would distract me, but I couldn't concentrate. My attention kept drifting to the living room, where the wet painting sat in the corner, dripping. My body felt tense, and every small noise made me flinch. A loose floorboard creaked, and I jumped. I stared at the door, expecting to see more paint seeping in. When I finally went to check on it, I saw that the painting had changed again. The figure was no longer inside the broken room. Instead, it stood in what looked like my current apartment, near the living room window. The background showed plastic sheets pinned to the walls. I felt my knees weaken. That was my setup right now. I could even see the reflection of my own easel in the background. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The moldy odor made me cough. I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom, door locked, lights on. I heard dripping noises, a soft tapping, and occasionally a wet squelch, like something thick was sliding across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the tension knotted my shoulders and made my muscles ache. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. My eyes were red and I had a throbbing headache. I opened the door and found smears of paint stretching from the living room into the hallway. The floor felt sticky under my bare feet. I gagged at the stench. When I finally stepped into the living room, I saw that the painting now showed a figure standing right at the edge of the canvas, with a hand reaching out. The hand was coated in wet paint. It left streaks across the surface. It looked like an invitation or a threat. My stomach churned. I approached it slowly. The paint on the frame was slick, and droplets fell to the floor in steady intervals. My breathing grew shallow. I was afraid to touch it, but I didn't know what else to do. I stood there trembling, my skin coated in a cold sweat. I could feel my heart hammering as I tried to figure out my next step. My apartment was cluttered with plastic sheets and stained rags. My eyes stung from the smell of mold and paint. I knew I couldn't live with this painting any longer. I had to get it out, or I had to leave. I felt like the walls were bending inward, closing me off from fresh air and sunlight. The painting seemed alive, an extension of something I couldn't understand. I took one last look at the figure's smeared face. It resembled me. I saw the shape of my jaw, the slope of my nose, and the coat I had long ago. My mind was a wreck. My nerves felt shredded. I had to escape that room. I dropped the rag on the floor, turned, and stumbled out into the hallway. I left the door open, letting the cold draft sweep through. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew I couldn't stay there. My only thought was to find a place without that smell, without those dripping sounds, without that creeping paint that followed me everywhere. I left the painting behind for a moment, but I knew it wasn't over. I could still smell it on my clothes, and I could still feel the chill on my skin. I still remember how the fog felt on my skin that night. It clung to my arms and made my hair feel damp and heavy. I was standing near the old fountain in the center of the square, trying to figure out which route would get me home the fastest. I had stayed out later than usual, hoping to avoid the weekend crowds in this tourist town. People come here all the time, searching for the older parts of the city with their hidden alleys and ghost stories. I never believed in any of that. But then I spotted the man in old-fashioned clothes. He was standing under a broken streetlight, looking around like he was lost. I noticed his suit right away because it looked like something from a vintage photograph. His jacket was dark, with wide lapels. His pants were slightly baggy. His shoes had a strange shine, like they were polished in a different way. I felt a slight chill, but I told myself it was just the weather. I walked closer to him, thinking maybe he was a reenactor or a performer who got separated from his group. He asked me for directions. His voice was soft but firm. He used words that felt out of place, like, "Excuse me, sir, I'm trying to find the corner of Raven Street and Marlborough Lane." The way he pronounced those street names sounded wrong. I live in the city. I know its main roads, its side alleys, and the place he was describing didn't exist on any map I'd ever seen. I told him I didn't recognize those names. He looked at me as though he didn't believe me. Then he pointed toward the east end of town, behind a row of tall buildings that used to be factories in the early 1900s. I felt uneasy. I tried to stay polite, so I said something like, "I can walk you part of the way if you want." He nodded once. We started walking together. The fog was thick, making the streetlights look dim. I heard the sound of dripping water from gutters. My shoes splashed a bit in the puddles. I glanced at the man's feet. He stepped in the same puddles but left no trace of moisture when he moved on. I thought maybe I was seeing it wrong because of the fog, but I looked again and there was nothing. No splatter, no shiny spot on the concrete where his foot should have left water. That made me feel a knot in my stomach. He walked in a straight line, keeping pace with me. I couldn't hear his footsteps. The only sounds I caught were my own breathing and the low buzz of a neon sign in a store window. I tried to make small talk, asking if he was visiting. He said he'd been around for a short time but needed to head home soon. I asked where he was staying, but he didn't give me a direct answer. He just said, "I need to reach that intersection before the hour is up." I checked my phone for the time. It was close to midnight. The battery was low, and the screen flickered for a second. I got a brief chill in my arms. As we continued, I noticed the storefronts looked older. The signs were weathered in a way I hadn't seen before. One store I passed every week looked like it had changed overnight. The letters on the sign were in an older font, and the paint was peeling. I tried to ignore it. I told myself the fog can make things look different, but my heart was racing. My palms felt sweaty. I tried not to make it obvious. We reached a narrow street that ended in a tall gate. It was locked. That gate had always been open before. People used that alley as a shortcut to the main square. Now it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Rust and chains covered the latch. The man stared at it for a moment. Then he turned to me without blinking. His eyes looked too clear, like water reflecting moonlight. I stepped back. I felt a sudden urge to leave. He said, "It's closed now." His voice sounded distant. I nodded but said nothing. I decided I'd better take a different route and point him in the direction of the old industrial area, hoping to get away from him. I turned around for a second, and when I glanced back, he was already behind me, standing too close. I felt his breath on my neck, though it wasn't warm. I almost jumped. He said nothing. I forced a cough and walked on. For the next few blocks, I sensed him near me, but I couldn't see him each time I turned my head. I felt tension in my shoulders. My neck felt stiff. My heart was beating faster than normal. I kept telling myself this was ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned onto the main street, hoping to see some late-night drivers or a security guard. The street was empty. The fog made the streetlights glow orange, giving everything a dull haze. When I reached my apartment, I fumbled with my keys. I looked around and didn't see him. I let out a shaky breath and rushed inside. The walls felt cold and the lights flickered for a second. I locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding. I went straight to my desk and tried to look up Raven Street and Marlborough Lane on my laptop. Nothing came up except an old reference in a local history forum. It mentioned a defunct neighborhood that existed decades ago. back when the city was just starting to build factories. The post was incomplete and had no pictures, just rumors about an abandoned district with a strange reputation. One user mentioned a lost tourist who appeared on foggy nights, asking for directions to that place. I read every word, feeling my chest tighten. I looked for more clues but found only vague posts about sightings of a man in outdated clothes. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I felt tired and restless. I went out to a local archive in the older side of town. It's a small building that keeps records, newspapers, and documents from the city's past. Inside, the light was fluorescent and the smell was like damp paper. I asked the clerk if they had any references to that old neighborhood. The clerk gave me a skeptical look but showed me a box of files from early city planning. I flipped through them and found a short note about a street named Raven. It was part of a development that got shut down because of financial issues. There was nothing about Marlborough Lane. I kept digging and I found a newspaper clipping from around that time. It mentioned an unusual disappearance. A visitor from out of town had vanished, leaving his belongings behind in a local inn. No official resolution was ever recorded. After that, the references stopped. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. My hands trembled a bit. I thought about the man's polished shoes and how he asked for directions. I felt a growing sense of dread. I hurried out of the archive and stepped into the daylight. People passed by me, talking and looking at their phones. Cars rolled by at normal speeds. But I still felt jumpy. I kept expecting to see him standing across the street or leaning against a lamppost. Later, I went back home, made some coffee, and tried to calm down. That night, I stayed in. I closed the blinds. I watched some TV with the volume low, but I couldn't relax. I felt like I was being watched. Around midnight, I looked out the window. The fog was back, thicker than ever. Streetlights looked weak. I stared at the building across from mine. There was a shadow on the sidewalk. It looked tall and still. My heart pounded. I stepped away from the window, afraid to keep looking. The next morning, I decided to walk around during the day. Maybe if I saw the normal city in sunlight, I'd convince myself it was all just an overreaction. The air was clear. No fog. People walked around with cameras taking pictures of historic sites. I felt a bit better. I strolled into a local bookstore that specialized in regional legends. The shelves were packed with paperbacks about ghosts, haunted mansions, and strange events. The store owner noticed me looking at one shelf, and he asked if I needed help. I told him I was curious about any stories involving a wandering tourist from another time. He raised an eyebrow. Then he pulled out a worn booklet from behind the counter. It didn't have a proper cover. It looked homemade. He said it contained collected accounts from various witnesses who claimed they encountered a mysterious traveler at night. The pages described sightings that matched my experience: an old-style suit, polite speech, an odd request for directions to places that no longer existed. I read about how some people felt like reality shifted around them when he was near. Buildings looked different. Street signs changed. One witness wrote that they saw an old clock tower appear where a modern structure usually stood. Another person described a sudden glimpse of gas-lit street lamps instead of electric ones. My stomach twisted again. I remembered how that locked gate had looked, covered in rust, as if abandoned for a long time. I had never seen it in that condition before. The store owner asked if I was okay. I nodded and put the booklet down. I left without buying anything because I felt too uneasy. That night I tried to stay indoors again. I locked my windows and placed a chair under the doorknob. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. It sounded like dripping water in my living room. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark and I heard my pulse thudding in my ears. I got up and turned on the lights. Nothing was there, but I still heard the drip sound. I followed it to the front door. A cold draft touched my face. My door wasn't locked anymore. It stood open by an inch. I slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt. My heart was pounding. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I must have forgotten to lock it fully. But my hands were shaking, and I felt a chill on my arms. I walked around, checking every corner. No one was inside, but I felt like I was not alone. The following day, I made up my mind to confront this. I grabbed a flashlight, wore a thick coat, and walked into the older part of the city around midnight. The fog rolled in again, soft and thick, muffling the sounds of cars and footsteps. I moved slowly, checking side alleys. The streetlights buzzed and my breath felt heavy. Then I saw him. He was at the end of a narrow street standing near a crumbling wall. I stepped closer, keeping the flashlight pointed at the ground in front of me. My footsteps echoed. He stared at me with those clear eyes, unblinking. He told me in a calm voice that he still needed directions. He asked again for Raven Street and Marlborough Lane. I told him I didn't have an answer, but I asked him what time he thought it was. He pulled out a watch. The casing looked tarnished. He said it was nearly midnight, but I looked at my phone and it was almost 1 a.m. I felt the tension in my chest. He held the watch up so I could see. The second hand wasn't moving like normal. It clicked back and forth in a short loop. I turned around and I saw the buildings flicker. For a second, it looked like I was standing on an older street. The signs changed to older designs. The windows were shuttered and I heard distant horse hooves on cobblestones. I shook my head. I felt nauseous. My flashlight dimmed, and when I looked back, the man was closer. I stepped back, pointing the flashlight at him. The beam flickered. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry. He reached out his hand as if inviting me to join him. I felt panic tighten my chest. I backed away. He moved closer, silent. I pointed the flashlight at his face, but the light didn't seem to hit him the same way it would hit a normal person. His eyes didn't reflect the light. They stayed dull. I turned and started running. I heard my own footsteps and the pounding of my heart. The fog thickened, and I lost my sense of direction. The houses around me shifted in appearance. Some looked modern, others looked decayed and abandoned. Every few steps I saw him out of the corner of my eye. He was always just in my peripheral vision, always the same distance away. I gasped for air, my mouth dry, my legs shaking. I kept moving until I stumbled onto the main street. A single car passed by, headlights glaring through the fog. I blinked and looked around. The architecture was back to normal. There was no sign of him. I stood there for a moment, hunched over, trying to catch my breath. My knees felt weak. I finally made it home. I locked my door carefully, checked it 3 times, and drank some water. My hands were still shaking. I realized this wasn't over. The next day I tried to act normal. I even went out to buy groceries. But every time I entered a quiet street, I looked around for him. At work, I felt distracted. I made small mistakes. I couldn't concentrate. My boss asked if I was sick. I just said I was tired. That night I sat at my desk reading old accounts again, trying to figure out what to do. Some people claimed you had to ignore him until he faded away. Others said you needed to leave town for a while so the connection would break. I wasn't sure if any of that was real. I decided to pack a bag. I needed to get away from this place at least for a few days. I couldn't stay if he kept appearing. My stomach churned at the thought of him dragging me into that other time. I thought about those brief flashes of old storefronts and rusted gates. It felt like the city was folding in on itself, blending the past and the present. I didn't know what would happen if I stayed in that state for too long. I had no interest in finding out. Right now, I'm zipping up my bag. It's almost midnight, and the fog is here again. I hear a faint tap on my window. I turn off the lights and I sit still, holding my breath. I can't see him from where I am, but I feel him nearby. My chest feels tight, and my heart is racing. I wipe sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. I'm leaving in the morning. I'm driving as far as I can. I'll stay with a friend in another city. Maybe after some time passes, I'll come back. Or maybe I won't. Either way, I'm not letting him drag me into his world. Not tonight. Not ever. I'm going to leave this place and hope the fog doesn't follow me. If it does, I don't know what else I can do. But I'll try anything to keep myself in my own time, in my own reality. That's all I can do right now. I arrived at the old palisade on a rainy afternoon, feeling a chill that crawled along my arms and settled in my chest. I was there for research, hoping to examine the architecture and collect stories about the building's past. I'd heard rumors about strange happenings, but I only half believed them. When I walked inside, the guide nodded at me without smiling. He was an older man with a tight jacket and tired eyes. He spoke quickly about the main hall, the upper floors, and the locked basements. Then his voice got lower. He pointed toward the far end of a dim hallway and said, "That's where the corridor of broken mirrors is. We don't go there unless we have to." He left it at that. I followed him around the main rooms, taking notes on my phone. The palisade felt damp, and the light bulbs in the corridors flickered from time to time. Every so often I glanced at the door that led to this corridor I'd heard about. Eventually he took me there. The place had a musty smell, like old wood and stale air. When I saw the corridor for the first time, I felt my stomach tighten. The walls were lined with mirrors of various sizes, all of them cracked or shattered. I saw large diagonal breaks, spider webs of broken glass, and dark frames with missing pieces. Shards crunched under my shoes when I stepped closer. He said, "Nobody cleans it up. Nobody replaces them. People who worked on them in the past said they felt something wrong. They refused to come back after the first attempt. We just leave them as they are." He gestured for me to step back, and he clicked off the light at the far end. The corridor got darker, and I saw my reflection in one of the less broken mirrors. My face looked older than I remembered. I asked why they didn't fix it. The guide shrugged. "They say these mirrors hold something in. I don't know what that means. I'm not superstitious, but it's not my job to find out." Then he left me alone to explore. I stayed there, shining my flashlight over the broken glass. I noticed that several cracks joined together in a pattern that almost looked intentional. The lines seemed to curve around each other in short arcs, linking different mirrors. It reminded me of old runes I'd seen in dusty manuscripts, but I couldn't make out any words. I felt uneasy. I checked my phone for a signal. Nothing. The corridor made me feel like I was under observation. My skin felt cold, and I rubbed my hands together to ease the tension. For the rest of the afternoon, I toured the palisade, took photos of the ceilings, the doorways, and the old paintings in the main hall. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to return to that corridor. Something about it called to me. I asked the guide a few more questions, but he didn't give me much. He only said that workers had tried to remove the mirrors decades ago, then gave up. He hinted they might be afraid of freeing something. I laughed it off in front of him, but I kept replaying his words in my mind. After dinner, I went to my small room on the second floor. The staff told me not to wander at night, but I couldn't let it go. I decided to check the corridor alone. They'd turned off the main lights, leaving only a few emergency lamps near staircases. The building felt deserted. My footsteps echoed on the old floorboards. My heart pounded with each step. I listened for any noise, but everything was quiet except for the occasional drip of water from somewhere above. I made my way to the lower level. I had a cheap flashlight in my pocket. I clicked it on and pointed it down the corridor. The reflection of the beam jumped across the shattered surfaces. The corridor was silent except for the slight hum of old electrical wiring. I walked in slowly, keeping my eyes on my reflection. At first, I only saw myself in the broken surfaces. My hair looked messy from the humidity, and my jacket hung awkwardly on my shoulders. I tried to breathe calmly. As I got halfway down, I noticed something strange. One of my reflections moved a little slower than I did, and then another reflection seemed to move faster, like it was getting ahead of me. I stood still and raised my right hand to see if I was just imagining things. Most of the reflections followed my movement, but the one in the far left mirror raised its hand a moment too soon, and it looked off. That version of me had a twisted expression on its face, like it was angry or disgusted. My chest tightened, and I took a step back. I heard a soft scraping sound. I aimed my flashlight along the floor. I saw that some loose shards were shifting slightly. The corridor had no draft, so I couldn't figure out why they were moving. My pulse hammered in my ears. I glanced at the row of mirrors again. A few of my reflections had normal expressions, but some didn't match. One looked terrified, with wide eyes and an open mouth, but I wasn't standing there with my mouth open. Another reflection pressed a hand to the glass as if trying to push through. Its eyes locked on mine. My hands started shaking. I tried to tell myself I was seeing things. Maybe it was the angle, or the cracks, or some trick of the light. But a part of me knew that wasn't true. I stepped toward the mirror with the reflection that looked terrified. My reflection stared right back at me, even though my actual face was calm except for a slight tremor in my lips. I reached out with my real hand, wanting to touch the mirror surface. My fingertips were a few inches away when I heard a faint creak from the ceiling. Something about that sound made me pause. Then I felt a slight vibration under my feet. I stumbled back, and the reflection in the glass changed. It now had an expression of rage, like it was furious that I had pulled back. My throat felt dry. I swallowed hard and I stepped away. The corridor felt narrower. My breathing was ragged. I looked at the cracks. They formed spirals and jagged lines that connected each mirror to the next. In the dim beam of my flashlight, these lines seemed to glow faintly. I could see them pulsing, almost like they had a heartbeat. They formed shapes that looked like strange letters. I heard a dull thump inside my ears, matching that faint pulse. My temples began to ache. The air smelled heavier, like old dust and something metallic. I reached up and touched my forehead, feeling a bit of sweat. My senses were on high alert. I turned around to see if the exit was still clear. It was, but it felt farther away than before. I pressed forward, deciding to leave, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. I took a few steps back toward the start of the corridor, then glanced at my phone. The time read a little after midnight. No messages, no signal. The quietness of the palisade made every small noise stand out. A slight click from behind me made me spin around, shining the flashlight toward one of the largest mirrors. That mirror was shaped like a tall rectangle, almost a full-body mirror. It was cracked in a dozen places, with 2 large pieces missing near the bottom. My reflection there looked normal at first. Then it turned its head to the side while I was still facing forward. That movement didn't match me at all. My stomach lurched and I froze. The reflection's eyes glared at me. Its lips parted, but I heard no voice. I couldn't look away. I saw a faint twitch in the reflection's jaw, as if it was trying to speak or scream. I felt my knees weaken, and I had to brace myself against the wall. The glass made a soft popping sound, like more cracks were forming. I heard it again, that slight crunch under my shoes, and I realized I was stepping on more shards that had shifted. The reflection kept staring, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked faster back toward the entrance of the corridor, but the flashlight flickered. The corridor plunged into near darkness. In that moment, I felt a cold gust of air brush past my neck, but I couldn't tell where it came from. My heart pounded. I tried to shake the flashlight to get it working again. When the beam returned, I saw several reflections along the row of mirrors. Each one had a different expression. Some looked as if they were screaming in pain. Others looked furious with clenched teeth. A few had their eyes rolled back. I felt pressure building in my chest. I wanted to run, but some part of me told me not to panic. I slowed my breathing, took short steps, and tried to stay focused on my surroundings. I could almost hear a faint rustling sound, like something was brushing up against the inside of the mirrors. I turned around once more to check the largest mirror. It was flickering, almost like a distant light was behind it. I walked closer, my feet unsteady. As I got near, I saw that the cracks formed a symbol in the center of the glass. It looked like 2 intersecting circles with a line across them. The line pulsed with a dull red glow. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but it felt real. I reached out to touch the surface. My fingertip brushed one of the cracks, and I felt a slight sting, like a static shock. I jerked my hand back and saw a small red mark on my skin. That was enough for me. I stepped away and started walking quickly toward the exit, but the corridor felt too long. I counted the mirrors as I passed. 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 10. Each mirror had a broken reflection of me, each one out of sync. My stomach churned and I forced my legs to keep going. My breathing was shallow. I tried to keep the flashlight pointed forward, but it kept jittering from how badly my hand was shaking. I heard more scraping sounds behind me, like something was sliding across the floor. I refused to look back. I wanted to get out, close the door, and never return. My head throbbed, and my eyes burned from staring into the flashlight's beam in that darkness. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep my focus. Finally, I reached the door. I glanced over my shoulder at the corridor. The reflections were still there, but some had vanished into the dark corners of the shattered mirrors. I felt a chill race up my spine. Then I pushed through the door and slammed it shut. I stood in the hallway, my back against the closed door. My chest rose and fell with every pant. I could still feel a slight throbbing in my ears, like I was hearing that weird pulsing symbol from the other side of the door. The palisade was silent. No one else was around. I stayed like that for a full minute, waiting for my heart to slow. When I finally moved, I locked the door from the outside with a small latch. It didn't seem like much, but it gave me a bit of comfort. Back in my room, I sat down on the bed. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I placed the flashlight on the nightstand and tried to catch my breath. I thought about what I had seen. Reflections that didn't match my movements. Faces contorted in rage or terror. Cracks glowing with some strange energy. I ran my hand through my hair, feeling the sweat at my temples. My clothes were damp. I stared at the wall, noticing that my vision was still a little blurry at the edges. I didn't think I could sleep, but exhaustion pulled at me. Eventually, I rested my head on the pillow. In the morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and a headache. My hands still tingled. I left my room and found the guide near the front entrance. I asked him if there was another key to that corridor. He said there was only one. I told him I locked it. He shrugged and said, "We can open it again if we really need to, but usually no one goes there." He didn't ask me why. He didn't seem to care. Maybe he'd heard the same questions before. I spent the rest of the day in the palisade, but I avoided that end of the building. I tried to focus on my research. I looked at old documents in the library, scanning pages for clues about the corridor. I found references to renovations done years ago, but nothing that explained why the mirrors were left that way. Every so often I felt a sudden wave of unease, as if the memory of the night before was crawling back. I'd remember those silent reflections glaring at me. My stomach would tighten and my palms would sweat. I packed my things by late afternoon. I planned on leaving before dark. I had more research to do, but I decided I'd prefer to do it from a safe distance, maybe in a local archive or library. The staff didn't ask many questions when I said I was leaving. They were polite but distant. I felt like an outsider who had stepped into a place where I didn't belong. While I waited for my ride, I walked around the garden, trying to let the fresh air calm me. But the memory of that corridor stayed fresh in my mind. I heard the car horn near the front gate and I carried my bag out. When I turned for one last look at the palisade, I saw something in the second-story window. It looked like a reflection or a shape, but it disappeared fast. I got in the car without mentioning it to the driver. As we pulled away, I felt a rush of relief, but I also felt tense. I had left the corridor behind me, but the images were still there, stuck in my head. That's all I can say about my time in that place. I'm a historian, and I've seen old ruins, abandoned sites, and all sorts of strange corners of the world. But nothing ever got under my skin like that corridor of broken mirrors. I keep thinking about those reflections that were so out of sync, the expressions that didn't match my face, and the cracks forming symbols that seemed alive. Sometimes, late at night, I close my eyes and see those mirrors. I feel that same pulsing dread. I open my eyes fast just to remind myself that I'm not trapped there. I don't know if I'll ever go back. Some part of me wants to, just to confront whatever was happening in there. But every time I consider it, I remember the fear in my chest, the sweat on my forehead, and the sense that something on the other side of the glass wanted to break through. For now, I'll stick to my files and documents. I'll try to learn more from a distance, I'm not ready to face those broken mirrors again. They can stay cracked, silent, and untouched, keeping whatever they hold inside. And I'm fine with that. I woke up that morning with a tight feeling in my chest, like my lungs were already preparing for the thin air up there. My gear was laid out next to me in the tent. I couldn't see much through the heavy fog outside, but I felt restless. I had planned this trip for months, and I wasn't about to turn back because of a little mist. I was at the base of one of the least explored mountains in the region. People said it was haunted, or that it hid something nobody understood. I wasn't sure if I believed any of that, but I liked the idea of being the only one fool enough to try. I packed my things quickly. The temperature was low, and my gloves felt stiff as I pulled them on. My breath came out in short puffs. I drank some water, forced down an energy bar, and started climbing around dawn. The slopes were steep, but I moved with caution. The fog clung to everything, and I could barely see a few feet ahead. Every few steps I tested my footing, made sure my boots had a good grip, and then pushed myself higher. The air got thinner, and my lungs burned a bit more with each hour. At one point, I stopped and looked down. The drop was huge, and my heartbeat grew faster. I reminded myself to stay calm and keep going. My arms shook a little from the cold, and my throat felt dry. I looked at the rope coiled around my shoulders. I had my ice axe, my spikes, and a small pack with some supplies. The plan was to reach the top before nightfall. I didn't want to risk an unplanned overnight stay on a mountain that was famous for sudden storms and heavy mist. By midday, the clouds thickened. The sky turned dark, even though it wasn't late afternoon yet. The wind picked up, and I struggled to keep my balance. The snow whipped across my face. My goggles fogged up, so I wiped them with my sleeve. I pushed on, feeling the sting in my cheeks. The slope got icier, and my boots slipped a few times, but I managed to hold on. I kept hearing a faint rumble like distant thunder. Then, without warning, a blizzard slammed into the mountainside. The wind howled, and I couldn't see anything around me. I crawled behind a large boulder for some shelter. The cold bit through my jacket. My teeth chattered, and my face went numb. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, maybe more. When the wind finally died down a little, I realized I had to find a better place to hide. I looked up and saw a shape in the distance. It looked like a small structure at the top of a ridge. I remembered the rumors about a cabin. People talked about a cabin near the summit that never froze. That sounded like a myth, but I had nothing to lose. I headed in that direction, taking slow, careful steps. As I got closer, the blizzard eased off, like the storm was pulling back. That was strange, but I was too cold to care about explanations. The structure came into view. It was a cabin, made of dark wood, with a steep roof. Snow piled around the sides, but it didn't seem to stick to the walls. There was a single door, no smoke coming from anywhere. The windows looked intact, but it was hard to see inside. I reached the door, gave it a gentle push, and it opened without resistance. I stepped in, and a rush of warmth hit me. It felt like a strong heater was running. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, letting the heat soak into my numb hands. My jacket started to drip meltwater onto the floor. I saw a fireplace, but there were no logs inside. The walls themselves gave off heat. My first thought was that maybe there was some kind of generator, but I didn't hear any machinery. The inside looked well kept. Furniture stood neatly arranged. A small wooden table with 2 chairs sat near one corner. A few shelves lined the walls, holding books and objects I couldn't identify right away. The cabin had a single main room with a door to what looked like a storage closet in the back. Everything felt preserved, as if someone had been there recently. But I saw no footprints on the floor, no scattered gear or signs of a caretaker. I set down my pack and rubbed my hands together. My heart rate slowed a bit, and the warmth made me want to sit down. My boots squeaked on the wooden floor. I took off my gloves and touched the wall. It felt slightly hot, almost like a radiator. That made no sense. I walked around, checking the corners. I heard a low thumping sound from below the floorboards. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a knock that came and went every few seconds. I looked at the ceiling. There were long scratches across the wood. They looked like claw marks. The shape and spacing suggested something with sharp nails had been up there. I frowned. It didn't look normal. The lines were deep and the wood was chipped in places. I tried not to focus on that, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I felt my skin crawl. A few pieces of cloth hung from a rope near the fireplace. They looked torn and stained. There were strange symbols or letters drawn on them. I had never seen that kind of writing before. It wasn't in any language I recognized. The edges of the cloth strips were frayed, and some of the markings had bled into the fabric. I reached out to touch one, but then I heard the thumping again. It seemed louder. My stomach clenched. I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. I glanced at the windows. Outside, I expected to see the swirling snow or the rocky slopes. Instead, I saw a busy street with cars and lights. It was nighttime in that view. I blinked and stepped closer. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion or dehydration. But the image stayed. I looked at another window and I saw a dense forest with tall trees. The trees moved in a breeze and I couldn't place where they might be. It definitely wasn't the mountain outside. I tried to open a window, but it wouldn't budge. The glass felt solid. I tapped it, expecting a normal response, but there was a weird echo. It sounded thick, like hitting a block of ice. I walked to the far corner, where there was another window, and it showed a desert landscape with rolling dunes. I heard faint sounds of wind blowing, but it didn't match the conditions outside. The cabin was in some sort of strange connection with places I didn't recognize. My mouth went dry, and I felt my pulse hammering in my neck. I tried to stay calm. I told myself maybe these were screens or monitors designed to look like windows, but the scenes were too real. They weren't grainy, and there was no pixelation. They looked like actual windows to other places. Then I heard the thumping beneath my feet again. It was stronger now, like something knocking against the floor from below. I grabbed my ice axe and held it by my side. My hand shook a little, and sweat formed on my forehead, even though the air was still cool enough to make me shiver. I took a few steps following the sound. The floor in the center of the room was slightly discolored, as if water had leaked there at some point. I got down on my knees and pressed my ear against the wood. There was silence for a moment, then a single knock. My heart jumped. I stood up fast, nearly losing my balance. I decided to check the storage closet. I reached for the doorknob, and the wood felt warm under my fingers. I opened it. Inside, I saw shelves with old canned goods and some tools. There was a small hatch on the floor, probably leading to a cellar or crawl space. I kneeled and lifted the hatch. A rush of air came out. It smelled musty, mixed with something sour. I pointed my flashlight down. I saw steps leading into darkness. The flashlight beam revealed dirt walls and a low ceiling. I couldn't see the end of the space. I climbed down, feeling the boards creak under my weight. Each step made a dull thud. At the bottom, I crouched and aimed the light in front of me. The space was narrow and the floor was damp soil. I moved a few feet forward and then I stopped. The walls had the same claw marks I saw on the ceiling upstairs. Some were fresh, with splinters still attached. Others were older, covered in dust. I felt a chill spread through my entire body. There was another piece of cloth pinned to the dirt wall with what looked like an old knife. The cloth had those same strange symbols. I held my breath and reached out to touch it. The surface felt rough. The symbols were drawn in a dark substance that might have been ink. I heard a sudden scraping noise behind me and I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. I didn't see anything move, but the noise continued, like something was dragging across the soil. My chest felt tight. I backed up, keeping the light aimed forward. The sound stopped and I tried to steady my breathing. My face felt hot and sweat rolled down my temples. I decided to get out of there fast. The place felt wrong. My instincts were screaming that I wasn't supposed to be there. I climbed back up the ladder, shut the hatch, and slid the closet door closed. My mind raced with questions, but I was more focused on the immediate need to get out. The windows still showed random places. A small cabin in a forest clearing, a modern cityscape, a hillside with green grass under a clear sky. None of those matched the blizzard outside. I looked at the front door. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I opened the door a crack and peered outside. The storm was still there, swirling snow over the mountain. I could see the ridge below, partially obscured by blowing flakes. The mist had thickened again. It looked dangerous. I felt the hot air from inside the cabin drift out, and the cold wind blew a burst of snow into my face. But that seemed less scary than whatever was going on inside. Before I stepped out, I heard the floor creaking behind me. I turned and saw that the main room looked darker. The walls still radiated warmth, but the light felt different. I glanced at the windows again. The scenes had shifted. One showed an empty hallway with stone walls. Another showed an open field with tall grass swaying in slow waves. Another showed a deserted alley with a single street lamp flickering. I heard a scraping sound along the ceiling. The scratch marks seemed deeper than before. I couldn't explain how that happened. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to speak out loud, like I was trying to convince myself that I could handle it. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice echoing a bit in the silent room. I didn't wait for a response. I knew nothing there would answer me with words. The pounding under the floor started up again, louder. I felt each knock vibrate through the boards. The doorknob felt cold in my hand, even though the rest of the cabin was warm. I took one last look at the interior. The shelves, the torn cloths, the scratched ceiling. The air inside felt thick, like stepping into a room that had never been opened. My throat felt constricted. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. I backed out slowly, not wanting to turn my back on the room. Then I pulled the door shut behind me. Outside, the cold stung my face and snow whipped around my legs. I stumbled a few feet away from the cabin, fighting the wind. I looked back. The building stood there, dark and silent, but still somehow giving off that faint glow. Snow didn't stick to the walls. Ice melted around the foundation. A circle of clear ground extended a few feet from each wall. I realized it might be more than just a warm cabin. It might be something else, something I didn't understand. I knew I had to descend the mountain, but the visibility was bad. I decided to move lower to find a safer spot. My limbs shook, not just from the cold, but from the tension I felt in every muscle. My pack felt heavier than before, even though nothing had changed in its contents. My mind kept flashing back to those windows. The idea of a cabin that looks out onto different places still makes my head spin. I found a small outcrop where I could take shelter. I hid there for a couple of hours while the storm calmed down. I kept glancing up at the ridge. Sometimes I swore I could see a faint glow from that direction, but it might have been my imagination. Eventually, I decided it was safe enough to keep climbing down. The snow had eased a bit, and I could see the rocky path below. The entire time I was descending, I felt like something was following me. I couldn't shake the feeling. Every shift of snow or crack of ice made me jump. My heart pounded, and I kept telling myself to focus on my steps. I could picture the scratched ceiling, the torn fabrics, and the insane windows that looked out on strange places, and those steady knocks beneath the floor. When I got to the base, I set up camp in a spot that felt secure. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cabin in my mind. I kept seeing those unknown symbols on the cloth. My heart would race, and I'd sit up, breathing hard, trying to remind myself that I was outside again. The temperature felt normal down there. The snow was just snow, and the rocks were just rocks. But my brain kept drifting back to what I'd seen. I had gone to that mountain expecting a challenge. I found something else entirely. I don't know who built that cabin or why it never freezes or how those windows worked. I'm just glad I got out of there. I still feel uneasy when I think about it. There's a part of me that wants to return one day and see if I imagined the whole thing. But another part of me knows I didn't imagine anything. I felt the heat from those walls. I heard the pounding under the floor. I saw the scratch marks and the strange fabrics. I saw windows that opened to places that didn't match the mountain. Something is going on up there, and I wasn't prepared for it. I managed to leave the mountain with most of my gear. I never told the local guides exactly what I saw. I just said I ran into a storm and decided to turn back. They joked that I must have gotten spooked by some old legend. I never argued with them. It's easier to let them believe I chickened out. The truth is too weird to explain. Even now, I feel a knot in my stomach remembering the warmth of those walls and those faint knocks that kept echoing in that silent cabin. I haven't climbed that peak again. I don't think I ever will. Whatever is at the top of that mountain doesn't belong in our world, and I'm not interested in finding out where else it might lead. I still go on other climbs, but I pick places that feel normal. I pack a little more carefully and keep an eye out for sudden changes in the weather. But no matter how cautious I am, I can't shake the memory of standing in that strange cabin looking out windows that showed impossible scenes, listening to something under the floor that should not exist. Sometimes I wake up at night with my heart pounding, convinced I hear those knocks in the distance. Then I remind myself I'm not on that mountain, but that warm feeling on my skin, that thick silence in the air, those claw marks on the ceiling, I don't think I'll ever forget them. I can still feel them in my bones, and I'm not sure I want to know what's hiding behind those windows or those scratched walls. I pushed open the crooked gate at my uncle's old farm and walked through the tall grass. My boots scraped against stones buried in the dirt. I felt sweat gathering at my temples. The air smelled stale, like mold and damp wood. As I got closer to the house, I spotted the well on the right side of the yard. It was made of uneven stone and covered with dark green moss. The stones looked slick, and patches of dried leaves clung to the edges. I stopped and stared at it for a moment. My heart thumped harder than usual. I didn't remember much about this place. I hadn't visited in years. Most of the wooden beams on the porch were warped or splintered, and some of the windows on the old house were cracked. But I couldn't stop looking at the well. Something about it got my attention right away. I walked over to it, curious, but also uneasy. A damp smell rose up from the pit, mixing with the earthy odor of wet moss. I placed my hands on the rim, feeling the rough stone and the cold moisture seeping into my palms. I leaned forward. It was dark inside, but I could make out a faint reflection of light near the bottom. At first, I figured it was just water catching a bit of sunlight. Then I noticed it had a bluish tint. It reminded me of a weak glow stick, the kind that barely lights up a tent. I stared a little longer, and that's when I heard the whisper. It wasn't a gust of wind. It was a voice, soft and low, like someone calling my name from a distance. My breath caught in my throat and my skin tingled. I pulled back, unsure if I'd imagined it, but I could still hear it, too quiet to make out real words, but definitely there. I rubbed my arms and let out a sharp exhale. My first instinct was to leave, but part of me felt drawn to it. I stayed still for a few seconds. The voice stopped. I listened hard, trying to see if there was some sort of echo or trick of the wind. Then I heard it again, a muffled sound that seemed to say my name. It mentioned things I hadn't thought about in a long time. Old birthdays, details about the layout of my bedroom in the city, small secrets that barely anyone else would know. My pulse sped up. I pressed my palms against the rough stone rim and leaned in again. It was darker inside the well this time, like the sun had shifted behind a cloud. The bluish glow was a bit stronger now. It flickered in a weak rhythm, almost like a dying flashlight. The whisper turned into a hushed, pleading tone. It asked me to help. I couldn't tell if it was male or female, just that it was desperate. I pulled myself away again, breathing faster than normal. I glanced around the yard. Everything else was silent. Even the light wind in the trees seemed to fade. I decided to step back, walk toward the house, and try to ignore the voice. My throat felt tight, and I found myself swallowing hard like I was trying to get rid of a sour taste. I explored the house for a while, checking the rooms I used to see when I visited as a teenager. Furniture was covered in sheets. Dust floated in the beams of light coming through the windows, and the floors creaked under my weight. The place felt hollow. I couldn't focus on any of it because the well kept coming back to my mind. I went back outside an hour later. I needed to see if the voice was just in my head. When I got there, I stood a few feet from the well. My hands were shaking a little, so I clenched them into fists. The voice was silent at first. I walked closer, and then it came again, clearer this time. It seemed to say, "Please come down. Help me." I leaned over the edge and strained my ears. I heard breathing, as if someone was at the bottom, waiting. The glow looked a bit brighter, a faint blue light dancing across the damp stones. My legs felt wobbly, and my heart pounded in my chest. I asked, "Who are you?" My voice came out shaky. No answer. I waited, feeling the breeze against my back. Then the voice whispered some detail about a jacket I used to wear in high school, mentioning a stain on the left sleeve. That detail was too random for anyone else to know. A surge of cold sweat prickled under my arms. I paced around the well, running my hand through my hair. That night I stayed in one of the few rooms that still had a functioning bed. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing that voice in my mind. Around midnight I thought I heard it again outside, calling my name in that same low whisper. I sat upright, my chest tight, my ears straining, but the sound was gone. When morning came, I decided to go back to the well and get to the bottom of this. I found a sturdy rope in the shed. It was old but looked strong enough to hold my weight. I looped it around one of the thick posts by the well, testing it a few times to make sure it wouldn't snap. Then I leaned over the edge, shining my flashlight down into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just wet stone walls. The light reflected on some water about 20 feet below. That faint bluish glow was deeper, maybe another 5 feet under the water's surface. I tried to see if there was any shape or figure, but it was too murky. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed back in a distorted way. Then I heard the whisper again, closer, but still muffled. It repeated the same request. "Help me." I felt a surge of adrenaline. My skin prickled, and I noticed goosebumps on my arms. My gut twisted with a mix of fear and curiosity. I had to decide if I was actually going to climb down. I stepped away from the well for a few moments, my head spinning with possibilities. There was no clear reason to trust a whisper in a well, but it knew things about me. It felt impossible to ignore. My heart was pounding, and I could feel a dull ache in my stomach from tension. I took a few deep breaths and tied the rope around my waist, making a makeshift harness. My hands felt clammy, and my legs shook a bit. I carefully lowered myself over the rim. My boots scraped against the slimy stones. The smell of damp earth got stronger, and drops of water splashed on my shoulders. A chill crawled up my back. I inched down, holding the rope tight, trying not to slip. The voice kept encouraging me. "You're doing good. Keep going. Almost there." It sounded so close, but I couldn't see anything except the reflection of my flashlight on the wet walls. When I reached the water level, I noticed a small ledge near the bottom. It stuck out about a foot from the wall. I planted my right boot on it and tried to get my balance. The water was dark and smelled stale. Little ripples spread out when I touched the surface with my flashlight. That's when I saw the bluish glow more clearly. It was underneath the water, flickering like an underwater lantern. The voice became louder, but it still sounded like a whisper. It said, "I can't get out. I'm stuck." I felt my chest tighten. I aimed the flashlight at the water, but the beam only went so far. I couldn't see any body or shape. My own breath sounded loud in my ears. My head throbbed from holding my breath too long between each movement. I took a quick inhale and exhale, trying to stay calm. The ledge was slippery, and I almost lost my footing. I asked, "How can I help you?" My voice cracked. There was a long pause. Then the voice whispered something about needing me to come closer. It said, "I can show you." My heart thudded. The idea of submerging myself in that cold, dark water made my mouth go dry. But the voice kept coaxing me, repeating personal details about my life. It mentioned the color of my first car, the name of an old friend I hadn't seen in years, and even a phrase I used to say when I was stressed out. Something about that knowledge felt invasive. The memory of those details made my scalp prickle. I realized I was dealing with something that wasn't just a random person trapped in a well. My stomach churned. I stared at the glowing spot under the water. I asked again who it was, but I got no answer, just another plea for help. I made my way back up the rope, my muscles straining. The further I climbed, the more I felt I was leaving something behind. The voice got quieter and quieter until I reached the top. I collapsed on the grass, breathing hard, my hands burning from gripping the rope. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything else. I found myself pacing around the farm, occasionally glancing at the well from a distance. It seemed to loom there, silent for now, but I knew it was waiting. The next morning, I tried to ignore the well and spent time checking the rest of the property. I looked at the barn, peeked inside old sheds, tested some rusted tools. But my eyes kept drifting to that stone circle in the yard. Eventually, I gave in. I walked over and stood at the edge. The voice started whispering immediately, as if it had sensed me coming. It was clearer now, almost like it was right behind me. I felt the hair on my neck stand on end. I shined my flashlight down again, even though it was broad daylight. The glow under the water looked a little stronger than before. I felt a jolt of anxiety shoot through my chest. My heart hammered and my breath hitched. The voice asked me to lower a rope into the water. It said it needed me to guide it up. I asked it how that would work if it was submerged. No response. Just that quiet, urgent request for help. I realized I was shaking my head, trying to reason with myself out loud, but my words felt hollow. I was alone here. Nobody else would confirm or deny the existence of this whisper. The well was the only thing that seemed alive. I grabbed another rope from the shed, a thinner one. I tied a small piece of wood to one end so it would sink slowly. I fed it down into the water, watching the glow shift a bit. The voice murmured something about the rope not being enough. It needed me, physically, in the water. I felt a wave of nausea. My shirt clung to my skin with sweat, and I could taste bitterness in the back of my mouth. I pulled the rope back up, trembling with confusion. Part of me wanted to run from the farm and never look back, but another part wanted to see what was down there. That night, I stayed awake in bed, my eyes on the ceiling. The house was quiet. I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. I thought about driving into town, but I felt trapped by my own curiosity. I imagined the water at the bottom of the well, that faint bluish glow, the voice that knew too much. My stomach tightened every time I pictured it. I caught myself gripping the sheet so hard my knuckles turned white. On the fourth day, I stepped outside early in the morning. Dew covered the grass,